You wouldn't last a day in medieval times because your modern body and mind are completely unprepared for a world where survival was a daily battle against forces you can barely imagine. Picture waking up in a smoky, one-room hovel shared with livestock, where the stench of unwashed bodies mingles with animal waste, and your breakfast consists of watery gruel that tastes like disappointment. This isn't some romantic fantasy of knights and castles. This is the brutal reality that awaited anyone unlucky enough to be born into the medieval world. Let me paint you a picture of what your first morning would actually look like. You'd wake up on a straw mattress crawling with fleas and lice, your body already aching from malnutrition and the hard wooden planks beneath you. The air would be thick with smoke from a poorly ventilated fire, burning your eyes and making you cough. Your stomach would be cramping from hunger, because yesterday's meal of black bread and thin porridge did nothing to satisfy your body's needs. And this would be considered a good day. Your modern immune system, pampered by antibiotics and vaccines, would be completely defenseless against the diseases that stalked every medieval village. Dysentery, typhoid, and tuberculosis weren't just inconveniences. They were death sentences. The Black Death alone killed 1/3 of Europe's population in just 5 years. Imagine watching your neighbors drop dead around you while you helplessly waited to see if you'd be next. But disease wasn't your only enemy. Famine was a constant specter haunting medieval life. When crops failed, which happened regularly due to poor agricultural techniques and unpredictable weather, entire communities would starve. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, people resorted to eating grass, tree bark, and even their own children. The chroniclers of the time wrote horror stories of cannibalism and parents abandoning babies they couldn't feed. Your modern expectation of 3 meals a day would seem like an impossible luxury. Even if you managed to find food, there was no guarantee it was safe to eat. Without refrigeration or proper preservation methods, meat would often be rancid by the time it reached your plate. Bread was frequently adulterated with sawdust, chalk, or ground bones to stretch the flour supply. Water sources were contaminated with human and animal waste, making every drink a potential death sentence. You'd be forced to consume weak ale or watered-down wine just to avoid poisoning yourself with the local water supply. The physical demands of medieval life would break your modern body within days. Peasants worked from sunrise to sunset in back-breaking agricultural labor, using primitive tools that required enormous physical strength. Your soft hands would be raw and bleeding within hours of wielding a medieval plow or scythe. Your back would be screaming from the constant bending and lifting required to tend crops or care for livestock. Medieval skeletons show clear evidence of arthritis, bone deformities, and stress fractures from the relentless physical demands of daily survival. And let's talk about the cold. Medieval winters were brutal affairs that could literally kill you in your sleep. Without central heating or proper insulation, homes were barely warmer than the outside air. Frostbite was common, and many people lost fingers and toes to the freezing temperatures. You'd huddle around a smoky fire with your entire family and whatever livestock you owned, sharing body heat while breathing air thick with toxic fumes. The Little Ice Age made these winters even more deadly, with rivers freezing solid and crops failing year after year. Personal hygiene was virtually non-existent. You might bathe once or twice a year if you were lucky. Your clothes would be crawling with parasites, and your teeth would be rotting out of your head from poor nutrition and complete lack of dental care. Open wounds would fester and become infected without proper medical treatment. Childbirth was so dangerous that many women wrote their wills before going into labor, knowing they might not survive. The social hierarchy was absolutely rigid and brutal. If you were born a serf, you were essentially property, bound to the land and subject to the whims of your lord. You could be beaten, imprisoned, or even killed for minor infractions. There was no justice system as we understand it, no human rights, no social mobility. Your life belonged to someone else, and they could do with it whatever they pleased. Violence was a constant presence in medieval life. Bandits roamed the countryside. Wars devastated entire regions, and even minor disputes could escalate to deadly confrontations. There were no police to call, no hospitals to treat your wounds, no safety nets of any kind. Justice was often administered through trial by combat or ordeal, where your survival depended more on luck than truth. The psychological toll would be overwhelming. Imagine living in constant fear of death, disease, starvation, and violence. Imagine watching your children die from illnesses that are easily preventable today. Imagine never knowing if you'll have enough food to make it through the winter, or if raiders will burn down your village tomorrow. The stress would be unimaginable, and there would be no mental health support, no therapy, no medications to help you cope. Even the wealthy faced dangers that would terrify modern people. King John of England died from eating spoiled peaches. Noble children regularly died from diseases we've forgotten exist. Castle life might have been more comfortable than peasant hovels, but it was still cold, drafty, and dangerous. Political intrigue could get you executed on a whim, and even kings weren't safe from assassination or rebellion. Your modern expectations of comfort, safety, and personal freedom would be completely shattered. There would be no hot showers, no comfortable beds, no varied diet, no entertainment beyond the occasional traveling minstrel. Your entire existence would revolve around the basic struggle to survive one more day. The concept of pursuing happiness or personal fulfillment would be utterly foreign in a world where simply staying alive required every ounce of your energy and attention. The religious restrictions would add another layer of misery to your already difficult existence. The church mandated frequent fasting periods, including the 40 days of Lent, when even the meager protein sources available to peasants were forbidden. Imagine being malnourished and then being told by religious authorities that you must give up what little food you have for spiritual reasons. The church also controlled vast amounts of land and resources while preaching to the starving masses about the virtues of poverty and suffering. Your modern education and skills would be completely useless. Your ability to use computers, drive cars, or work in an office would mean nothing in a world where survival depended on knowing how to plant crops, preserve food, tend livestock, and craft tools with your hands. You'd be starting from absolute zero in a world where ignorance could literally kill you. The simple act of traveling would be a life-threatening adventure. Roads were little more than muddy tracks frequented by robbers and wild animals. A journey of 50 miles could take weeks and might cost you your life. There were no maps, no GPS, no roadside assistance if something went wrong. Getting lost could mean death by starvation or exposure. Even basic communication would be nearly impossible. Most people were completely illiterate, and even if you could read and write, it wouldn't help you much since books were incredibly rare and expensive. News traveled slowly and was often unreliable. You might not learn about major events like wars or plagues until they directly affected your village. The legal system was arbitrary and brutal. Punishments for minor crimes included public flogging, branding, or having body parts amputated. Torture was routinely used to extract confessions, and executions were public spectacles designed to terrorize the population into submission. There was no presumption of innocence, no right to legal representation, no appeals process. Your modern sensibilities about gender equality, racial tolerance, and human rights would be completely alien concepts. Women were considered property, minorities faced systematic persecution, and the entire social order was built on the assumption that some people were inherently worth more than others based on the circumstances of their birth. The environmental conditions alone would probably kill you. Air pollution from constantly burning fires would damage your lungs. Water pollution would poison your digestive system. Soil contamination would affect the crops you depended on for survival, and there would be no environmental protection agencies, no clean air acts, no regulations to protect you from these hazards. Perhaps most importantly, you'd lack the psychological resilience that medieval people developed from birth. They were hardened by constant exposure to death, disease, and deprivation. You, on the other hand, have been raised in a world of relative safety and comfort. Your first encounter with medieval brutality would likely break your spirit long before it broke your body. The simple truth is that medieval life was a grinding, relentless struggle against forces completely beyond your control. Every day was a battle for survival that you were more likely to lose than win. Your modern advantages, education, medical knowledge, and technology would be useless in a world that operated by completely different rules. So the next time you complain about slow internet or a cold cup of coffee, remember that you're living in the most comfortable, safe, and prosperous time in human history. Your ancestors endured unimaginable hardships so that you could enjoy luxuries that medieval kings could never have dreamed of. But perhaps nothing captures the impossibility of medieval survival quite like the reality of medieval medicine and healthcare. When we think about not lasting a day in medieval times, we often focus on the obvious dangers, the wars, the famines, the plagues. But it's the smaller things, the everyday ailments that would claim us first, that truly illustrate just how precarious life was back then. Imagine waking up with what we'd consider a minor headache today. In our modern world, you'd reach for an aspirin, drink some water, maybe take a quick nap. Problem solved. But in medieval times, that headache could be the beginning of the end. Without any understanding of proper diagnosis, that headache might be treated with bloodletting, literally draining your blood, because physicians believed it would balance your bodily humors. The cure, in many cases, was worse than the disease. And speaking of diseases, let's talk about what would happen if you caught something as simple as a cold in medieval times. Today, we know it's caused by a virus. We know to rest, stay hydrated, maybe take some vitamin C. Back then, they had no concept of germs or viruses. They thought illness was caused by bad air, an imbalance in your body's humors, or even divine punishment for your sins. So instead of rest and fluids, you might be prescribed a mixture of herbs that could actually make you sicker, or worse yet, more bloodletting. The medieval approach to medicine was, quite frankly, terrifying. Surgeons, if you could even call them that, learned their trade not in medical schools, but as apprentices to other surgeons, passing down techniques that were often more harmful than helpful. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, without proper sterilization, often without even a basic understanding of human anatomy. The mortality rate for even minor surgical procedures was astronomically high. But here's what's really mind-blowing about medieval medicine. They actually thought that examining a patient's urine could diagnose any illness. Physicians would hold up a flask of urine to the light, examining its color, consistency, even taste it sometimes, and from that alone, they'd determine what was wrong with you and how to treat it. It sounds almost comical now, but this was considered the height of medical sophistication at the time. And let's not forget about dental care, or rather, the complete absence of it. Tooth decay wasn't just painful in medieval times, it was potentially fatal. Without proper dental hygiene or treatment, a simple cavity could lead to serious infections that could spread throughout your body. Most people lost multiple teeth by their 20s, if they lived that long. And if you needed a tooth extracted, well, that was usually done by the local blacksmith or barber, not a trained dentist, because trained dentists simply didn't exist. The lack of medical knowledge extended to childbirth as well, which was incredibly dangerous for both mother and child. Maternal mortality rates were shockingly high. It's estimated that 1 in 3 women died in childbirth, or from complications shortly after. There was no understanding of proper hygiene during delivery, no knowledge of how to handle complications, and certainly no pain management. For many women, pregnancy was essentially a death sentence they had to hope they'd survive. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how mental illness was understood and treated in medieval times. What we now know to be treatable conditions like depression, anxiety, or bipolar disorder were seen as either demonic possession or divine punishment. Treatment might involve exorcism, being chained up, or being abandoned by your family and community. There was no concept of therapy, medication, or compassionate care for those struggling with mental health issues. And yes, some medieval treatments did have merit. Willow bark contains the precursor to aspirin, for instance. But for every potentially helpful herb, there were dozens of completely useless or actively harmful treatments. They might prescribe ground unicorn horn for various ailments, not realizing they were actually using narwhal tusks or other animal parts. They believed in the healing power of precious stones, thinking that wearing certain gems could cure diseases. The pharmaceutical industry of medieval times was essentially a combination of wishful thinking, superstition, and outright fraud. Traveling medicine men would sell miracle cures that were often nothing more than alcohol mixed with random herbs and spices. And people bought them because they were desperate, because there were no alternatives, because the alternative was accepting that there was simply no help available for their suffering. What's particularly heartbreaking is how this lack of medical knowledge affected families. Imagine being a parent watching your child suffer from what we now know is an easily treatable condition, but having absolutely no way to help them. Imagine the guilt, the helplessness, the desperation of trying remedy after remedy, none of which work, many of which make things worse. The emotional toll of medieval life wasn't just about the big tragedies. It was about the constant, grinding reality of being unable to help the people you loved when they needed it most. And here's something that really drives home how different medieval life was from ours: life expectancy. While it's true that those who survived childhood had a decent chance of living to old age, childhood itself was incredibly dangerous. It's estimated that up to half of all children born in medieval times died before their 5th birthday. Half. Can you imagine a world where having a child was essentially a coin flip for their survival? This wasn't just due to disease, though disease was certainly a major factor. It was also due to malnutrition, accidents, and the general harshness of medieval life. Children worked from a young age, often in dangerous conditions. They were exposed to all the same health hazards as adults, but with less developed immune systems and smaller, more fragile bodies. The psychological impact of this reality on medieval people cannot be overstated. Death was not just common, it was expected. Families had to emotionally prepare for the likelihood that they would lose children, spouses, parents, siblings to disease, accident, or violence. This constant awareness of mortality shaped every aspect of how they lived. how they planned for the future, how they formed relationships. And yet, despite all of this, medieval people found ways to cope, to find joy, to create meaning in their lives. They developed strong community bonds, partly out of necessity. When death could strike at any moment, you needed people you could rely on. They found comfort in religion, in the belief that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. They celebrated life's small pleasures more intensely, because they knew how fleeting those pleasures could be. But none of this changes the fundamental reality that as a modern person, you simply would not survive in medieval times. Your immune system, adapted to our relatively clean, modern environment, would be overwhelmed by the constant exposure to diseases and pathogens. Your body, accustomed to modern nutrition and medical care, would quickly succumb to the malnutrition and lack of treatment that were simply facts of life back then. Your mind, shaped by modern concepts of individual rights, personal agency, and the expectation of safety and comfort, would struggle to cope with the constant fear, uncertainty, and powerlessness that defined medieval existence. The very things that make us successful in the modern world, our reliance on technology, our expectation of instant solutions to problems, our belief that there should be a way to fix whatever's wrong, would become sources of constant frustration and despair in a world where most problems simply couldn't be fixed. This isn't to romanticize medieval times or to dismiss the very real hardships that people still face today, but it is to recognize just how much progress we've made, how much we take for granted, and how truly fortunate we are to live in an age where a headache is just a headache, where a broken bone can be set and healed, where mental illness can be treated with compassion and medicine rather than chains and exorcism. So the next time you flip a light switch, turn on a tap for clean water, take an aspirin for a headache, or visit a doctor for a checkup, take a moment to appreciate the incredible luxury of these simple acts. Because in medieval times, such conveniences weren't just unavailable, they were literally unimaginable. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is why you wouldn't last a day in medieval times. Not because you're weak or spoiled, but because you're human. And human beings simply weren't meant to live under such harsh, unforgiving conditions without the tools and knowledge we've developed over centuries of progress. The medieval world was a place where survival was never guaranteed, where comfort was rare, and where hope often required a kind of faith that's difficult for us to comprehend today. It was a world that shaped our ancestors into people of incredible resilience and strength. But it was also a world that claimed far too many lives far too soon. And for that, we can be grateful that those dark ages are behind us, while never forgetting the lessons they can teach us about the preciousness of the life and health we so often take for granted.